Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much to Catherine and James and all of the King's team for having me. It's nice to contribute and great to see that events like this are happening now, and this is, transitioning nicely into the mainstream. So what I'll do with this talk is try and cover basic mechanisms. Let me first get my laptop to work. Yes, and some of these intro slides I can gloss over because Alan has nicely covered them. Psychedelics, you'll have heard, what are they? What does the term mean? Its etymology comes from the combination of two ancient Greek words, psyche, for mind, or more accurately soul, and this other component which is referring to making manifest, making visible. And so that principle that these are compounds that make the mind visible should be naturally intriguing, and I'm pleased that this is stuck as the term that we use now to refer to these compounds, because I do believe that principle is valid. Here are some classic psychedelics. You can see psilocybin, the prodrug of psilocin. It's psilocin that works on the serotonin system in a particular way. We'll talk about that in a moment. Dimethyltryptamine, structurally very similar to psilocin. And you can see LSD, arguably the prototypical psychedelic in the sense that it was only after LSD was discovered by Albert Hofmann that some 10 years later, actually, the term psychedelic was coined, and it was really LSD that catalyzed a wave of scientific and medical interests in psychedelics in the West around the 1950s into the 1960s. But you just have to look at the molecular structure of these compounds to see that similarity with this naturally occurring neuromodulator serotonin that we know is involved in such a broad range of functions: cognition, sleep, modulating consciousness, modulating mood famously. And we also now know, as Alan touched on, that it is a certain component of this very complex system, the serotonin system being especially complex with at least 14 different receptor subtypes that often do very different things to each other. Yet we now know with a very high degree of confidence that there's a particular serotonin receptor that is critical to the mechanism of action of these compounds, and it's the serotonin 2A receptor. And you can see this very nice PET image on the left there using an agonist ligand. So here we're labeling these receptors in their high affinity state. These are functionally active receptors, so a bit of an advance on the kind of knowledge that we had of the serotonin 2A receptor system has come about by the use of this agonist ligand only really recently in the last 5 years or so. And so if we look at these maps, you can see in terms of the spatial distribution of the serotonin 2A receptor, these hot areas where the expression is especially strong. And you'll see that it's strong in the cortex, comparably in subcortical regions. There's really quite low expression of the 2A receptor, something that's not always appreciated. If you look at the spatial distribution of most most receptors, you won't see this interesting gradient. And indeed, if you look at the expression of other serotonin receptors, the 1A, for example, again, you don't see this interesting dichotomy where there's so much in the cortex and so little subcortically. There's a lot of 1A in subcortical regions, for example, and also in the midbrain. So that's curious, and a theme that you'll hear a lot of in this talk will be hierarchy. It's something that I think could be essential to the mechanism of action of psychedelics, and it's also something that speaks to our understanding, or at least I would say prominent models of brain function, hierarchy. So what do we know about this 2A receptor that gives us confidence that it's so important in the action of psychedelics? Well, we know that the affinity of a given psychedelic for this receptor, and also knowing that these compounds are agonists, they stimulate the 2A receptor. So the affinity, as Alan showed, correlates very strongly with their potency. LSD, very high affinity for the 2A, very potent compound. You only need a very small amount of it to have its typical psychoactive effects. We also know that if you pre-treat, and there are multiple studies now showing this with different psychedelics, different teams, that if you pre-treat with an antagonist for this receptor, a blocker, and then you give the psychedelic, essentially people won't have a psychedelic experience. The subjective effects are very markedly muted to the point of essentially being abolished by the antagonist pre-treatment. So already this is very solid evidence for the importance of the receptor. We've, in collaboration with some researchers in Barcelona and also in Oxford, Morten Kringelbach and Gustavo Deco, we plugged the spatial distribution of the 2A receptor into computational models of brain function, and through including that parameter, we were able to predict the functional brain effects of LSD from our fMRI data. So further evidence there, and if we use the spatial distribution of other receptors, for example, the serotonin 1A receptor, we couldn't recapitulate those findings. So again, emphasizing the importance of the receptor. And now we really have this, very compelling finding from Gita Knudsen's team in Copenhagen, showing that the occupancy of psilocybin for the 2A receptor is correlating significantly, albeit in a non-linear relationship, but nevertheless a clear quadratic relationship there, correlating both with the plasma concentration of psilocin, that active metabolite of psilocybin, and also the subjective effects. So the higher the occupancy, so meaning more of those 2A receptors are getting bound to by the, we presume, psilocin, displacing the PET ligand, and the greater the extent of this, the stronger the subjective effects and the more psilocin is in the blood. So again, very compelling evidence now for the importance of this receptor. And it leaves open this question, I won't scare you with that slide just yet, do we need to know more about the specifics of the signaling pathways that are engaged by these drugs? And of course we do, but I do think we can still rest to some extent on this foundational importance of the 2A receptor as well. That knowledge could only supplement what we already know, that the receptor is important. And I think it's fair to say where we are right now, we still don't know what those specific signaling pathways are and which ones are vital for the action of psychedelics, and quite also what they do functionally. But at least we know that the 2A receptor is important. What does the 2A receptor do in terms of the functional implications of it being activated? Well, I can summarize this slide, and really I've put just a bunch of references in only to say that there's a lot of support for this principle. What is the principle? Well, it's that serotonin itself is very much involved in modulating plasticity, but the 2A receptor specifically seems to be very important in promoting plasticity in the broad sense. So let's run through some of those evidences. First of all, serotonin being involved in plasticity and environmental sensitivity. You have the likes of Igor Branky talking about this double-edged sword of plasticity, that if you promote serotonin function, you'll promote sensitivity to the environment, and if the environment is enriched, then that will be a good thing. But if it was adverse, then perhaps having high serotonin levels and high sensitivity to context might not necessarily be a good thing. And that's something that he's shown quite elegantly in animals and in an indirect way in humans by looking at different doses of SSRIs. We can move on to the importance of serotonin in brain development in general. A lot of different evidence is supporting that in terms of things like neuronal differentiation, processes that we know are so important for brain development. Also, windows of plasticity or critical periods that seem to be modulated by serotonin. But let's move on more specifically to the 2A receptor and agonism being associated with the promotion of low-level learning. So this is important to emphasize. This isn't a sort of conventional learning paradigms. This is very low-level associative learning in animals, aversive responses to air puffs, for example, in the eye, but nevertheless intriguing, and also some research showing that cognitive flexibility, reversal learning, for example, can be promoted by serotonin 2A receptor agonism as well, and blocking it can blunt that and promote the opposite, so perseveration. So we can also move on to recent findings. Here, this is just really speaking, this is a PET image speaking to how the 2A receptor is especially high during key development periods. There's a 21-year-old person's brain with a lot of expression of 2A and comparatively a 68-year-old. And of course, young people are particularly plastic. They need to be. They're learning all the time. And so it's interesting just to contextualize this by bringing the 2A receptor into that picture. But here's a schematic really from a recent study published in Cell showing quite marked increases in synaptogenesis with different classic psychedelics. Ketamine also seemed to do the same thing. Obviously, all these compounds, it's dose dependent, but the effects with the classic serotonergic psychedelics seem to be especially pronounced, even when compared with ketamine. And the last one we have here is that 2A agonism promotes neuronal differentiation. What does that mean? Well, differentiation in the brain is, you could describe as specialization in the brain. So systems parcellating off from each other in order to do specific functions. That's how the brain ordinarily develops. It becomes specialized. But what you seem to get with serotonin 2A receptor agonism, at least transiently, temporarily, is this neuronal de-differentiation, where modules, systems become less distinct from each other, in some ways less specialized. And you could characterize that, given that differentiation is something that happens ordinarily, developmentally in the brain, in the developing brain, as a kind of regression. The system, the brain, is going back to a state where it is more open, perhaps, less specialized, and there may be a function to that. What might that function be? Well, what promotes 2A functioning? What upregulates 2A functioning? Well, stress does, and there's really quite a broad range of evidence that supports this. There's a reference to a review paper that I wrote with David Nutt, at least he came along for the ride, on this idea of 2A receptor being involved in adaptability and under conditions of stress. It may well be advantageous to be able to be on your toes, to be flexible, to be adaptable. And so the argument is, and it's a key question, why do we have these receptors? What do they do? We really need to know that evolutionarily. Otherwise, it leaves open the door for wild speculations that somehow this is something to do with psychedelics or endogenous psychedelics. An interesting thought, but perhaps a more sober alternative is that these receptors are still there for serotonin, but they engage especially under extreme conditions, such as conditions of extreme stress. Now this, in some ways, can be a slide for somebody else because it's going to get covered quite a lot today. So the best I can do is just summarize it. And it's going through the modern clinical research. First of all, the safety profile that does seem to be positive with these classic psychedelics, and just hearing about ketamine, thinking about things like its toxicity profile, and just reflecting that there's a much more favorable toxicity profile with psilocybin, and yet some of those advantages that people will talk about with ketamine, these rapid drops in depressive, the severity of depressive symptoms, drops in suicidality, well, you see those with psychedelics as well. There's evidence in a population study by Peter Hendricks of drops in suicidality, and also when we looked at the specific items in our depression scales, granted in our open label trial in TRD, we were seeing only drops or no change, mostly drops in suicidality, but no one increased. And I think that's worth knowing. And as we go forward, it's something that we're going to look at more and more. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if that story that's come into the picture with ketamine and seems to be something quite attractive about ketamine is going to be there as well with these classic psychedelics and psilocybin specifically. So the toxicity profile is positive, and again, the addiction potential that you see with ketamine and being reminded of the association with potential opiate release, and you block that and you block the antidepressant effects. Ketamine is a drug of potential abuse, and it can also be addictive, and that's not something that you see with these classic psychedelics. They're not classically rewarding drugs. They don't produce a hedonic response. If anything, I would argue fundamentally the experience is aversive. People don't like it. It can be frightening. It's, I think, probably fundamentally a challenging experience. Granted, it can also be euphoric, but people often have to go through some kind of struggle in order to have that kind of experience. So I think the challenging nature of the psychedelic experience is probably its major limitation, that this is tough. But in some ways, there might be something that is kind of ironically advantageous about that in terms of its abuse potential. So primary side effects, we know from our study and others of acute anxiety, speaking to the challenging nature of the experience. Headaches as well seem to occur in roughly half of the individuals who get a high dose of psilocybin. They usually last for a day or two afterwards. Psychosis acutely, you will see resemblances to aspects of psychosis, particularly early psychosis and acute psychosis, but these experiences appear to be transient cases of enduring psychosis after psychedelics are rare to non-existent really in the modern trials. I only know of one case that was reported that nevertheless improved as well with treatment. So very, very rare with careful screening. HPPD, hallucinogen persisting perceptual disorder, difficult to know quite what its prevalence is. It seems to be on the low side and distressing in very few, but nevertheless you do hear of these reports as well, and that's something to factor in terms of limitations. So now let's run through the sort of positive flip side. Again, these rapid and enduring improvements in depressive symptoms. I was never really sold on the idea that you can look at drops in depressive symptoms in the domain of minutes or even hours, really, as people say with ketamine. But we did measure depressive symptoms the next day and, of course, the next week and see very significant drops there. And the improvements do appear to be enduring. I'm not going to base that entirely on our little study, open label study, but it's something that's been seen in double-blind RCTs, such as the cancer trials with psilocybin. And so it does seem to be, again, a potential advantage of psilocybin over ketamine, for example, where repeat administrations seem to be the rule there. That doesn't seem to be the case with psilocybin. Often it's just one or two experiences that can produce these rapid and quite long-lasting improvements. So just running through the modern trials, OCD was the first in 2006, just a small study but promising. End-of-life distress, this is something of the more robust designs now, double-blind RCTs. Addiction, Matt Johnson, for example, looking at smoking addiction, and Michael Bogenschutz, alcohol. Depression, we've looked at psilocybin, and of course there's now a big wave of people looking at this as well, which is mainly, one of the main reasons why we just had to get our open label study done, knowing that that would probably create a kind of snowball effect. And also people looking at ayahuasca, and again, this rule of rapid and often enduring improvements seems to hold up, and the investments coming in and regulators appear to be on side now. For example, the FDA granting breakthrough therapy designation to psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. Research there that happened relatively recently. What are we doing right now at Imperial? We're running a trial looking at psilocybin, 2 treatment sessions with a high dose of psilocybin, 3 weeks apart versus 6 weeks of escitalopram. So quite a sort of, putting our money where our mouth is, so to speak, and really putting this to the test now. And that is coming from a place of some confidence. It's a very tough test, of course, but we wouldn't be doing it if we didn't believe that we might see something here. Now, all of that, you boil it down, and it might leave you thinking that there's something very intriguing here, something potentially trans-diagnostic in its efficacy, potentially, that it can treat different things. You saw end-of-life anxiety there, addiction, depression, things that previously have been targeted by different drugs with different pharmacologies. But here, there's this idea that with the same drug, it might treat different disorders. And so if you boil that down, it might leave you thinking, is there something common, some common denominator to these different disorders that might be targeted by psychedelics? And this is where I just want to move the talk for the remaining 10 minutes, okay. And it's really appealing. I'm bringing you back now to hierarchy and more specifically hierarchical predictive coding, a prominent model in cognitive neuroscience, model of really how the brain works, that's looking increasingly appealing in psychiatry, in the domain of computational psychiatry, and I think it is a model that we can use to think about the action of psychedelics. So what might be this common denominator? And I'll just put forward that it might be something to do in the language of predictive coding with high-level priors, with beliefs, with assumptions, that they become entrenched. In depression, we can think of the negative cognitive bias, where the individual thinks of themselves as worthless and life as pointless. But this rule could also extend to things like eating disorders, where people see themselves as bigger than they really are, or ugly and such like. And even addictions, where the attachment might not necessarily be in the domain of a belief as such, although it might be as well in terms of despondency and a withdrawal from society and self-loathing and such like. But the attachment and the entrenchment can be around a particular object of addiction. And so this rule of models being stamped in psychopathology is one that I would submit maybe the very thing that psychedelics can target. And so what would you need in a situation of beliefs and habits that have become stamped in? Well, first, you would assume that you want to relax those beliefs. You need some kind of window of openness where you can relax them, and only through relaxing them can you revise them. And you'll have seen plenty of examples of this kind of thing. I'm not sure if you'll be able to read it at the back. I'm not sure if you'll be able to read it anyway, but it's the rule that we experience the world through grouping, perceptual grouping, and and Gestalt processing on a more general level, that even though these letters are jumbled up, we can read that kind of text, and we see optical illusions like this, and instead of seeing it as static, at least some of you will probably see some hallucinated motion in there. Of course, this is static. Do any of you see that moving? Yeah, I see some nodding heads. So, you know, and this is, it can be referred to as Bayes-optimal processing, that the motion is implied, and so it's useful to have these models. It helps guide our processing of the world. And really, this is just a schematic that I put together about hierarchical predictive coding, that we have these internal mental models that predict sensory information, whether coming in through the sensory epithelium or coming up through interoceptive processing, through signals that are there internally in our body. And this is the simplest possible schematic I could come up with for a hierarchy with just two components with high-level cortex. Remember, where are the 2A receptors? They're in high-level cortex. And this can be a kind of schematic that can help us think of how the brain operates ordinarily, but it's also useful for thinking of psychopathology, where the rule is that there is excessive precision, as to use the term that's used in hierarchical predictive coding, or simpler, these beliefs, these high-level priors are heavily weighted, they're heavily expressed. And if they are expressed to a extreme level, then there won't be much information coming up into the system. You can think of anhedonia, for example, a disconnect from the world, a disconnect from the body, any kind of bottom-up signal, even a disconnect from memories. And this is sort of, you know, ordinarily this heavily weighted nature of the system is more or less how the brain works, but it's this mechanism that goes awry, hypothetically, in a lot of psychopathology. And so it's this extreme form, in a way, of how the brain works ordinarily. I put a tractor landscape up there just to appeal to the notion of places within a state space in which the system, a strongly hierarchical system, could get stuck. You could think of depression as a literal depression, like a big depression in this landscape where it sucks you in and it's hard to get out of it. You could also bring in the notion that is very relevant in the context of complex systems of the recovery rate of a system to a perturbation. In complex systems theory, it's called critical slowing, and the slowing there means there's a slow recovery to a perturbation. But imagine dropping a rock on a frozen system and it having, you know, no recovery time at all, very, very quick recovery, because there's no give in that system. So this is an example where there wouldn't be critical slowing. But in a moment, I'll show you an example where there would be. But just to give you a bit of patient context here, you have an individual from our trial saying, I would look at orchids and intellectually understand that there was beauty, but not experience it. So this is appealing to that disconnect that seems potentially to be a common denominator in a lot of psychopathology. And of course, an ideal of the therapeutic process would be that there's a reconnect or a realignment. And that may well be a realignment between our internal models and the rest of the system and its receptivity to data coming in. Here's a patient after the treatment saying, when I went outside, everything was very bright and colourful and it felt different. I noticed things I didn't notice. Usually the leaves on the trees and the birds, the small details. So what might a system, this ordinarily hierarchical system, look like under a psychedelic? So really here's the essence of the model that I wanted to present today. It's something I'm writing up at the moment with Carl Friston, obviously a key figure in this model of brain function, hierarchical predictive coding. And the simple idea is that there is a relaxation of the weighting of the high-level priors. And the effect of this is to allow for more information flow from lower levels of the hierarchy, and also a more sensitized system. So these high-level priors are not just relaxed, but they're also going to be more receptive to, more sensitive to this information coming up, more like a system that would show critical slowing, where if you perturb it, it takes a long time. It's slow to recover from the perturbation. What might the energy landscape look like, the state-space landscape? Well, it will be flattened. You wouldn't get stuck in those basins of attraction. You would be able to move more freely between them. So that's the schematic, and I think it could be useful to guide our science, our experiments that we run, that we test this. There's already a bit of evidence, well, you would hope so, that supports the model, which is summarized in the paper that's under review. For example, that the 2A receptors are heavily expressed in high-level cortex, that 2A agonism causes cortical dysregulation, high-level networks and associated rhythms like the alpha rhythm that's correlated with high-level networks like the default mode network appear to be dysregulated quite profoundly by psychedelics. There's also effective connectivity analyses looking at directional information flow, which is suggesting now reduced top-down influence and increased bottom-up information flow. And the phenomenology, of course, very much appeals to this model. Ego dissolution. What's the ego? It's a belief. It's an assumption, a very high-level one. And so it very much ties in intuitively on that level, I think. You can look at perceptual priors, such as the Kanisa triangle. That's that incomplete triangle that naturally we group. We see a triangle, but in some ways it's not a triangle, it's just implied. Binocular rivalry, where two different images are presented to each eye, and you suppress one of them, because that's what we tend to do. We suppress out information to allow us to focus on one particular thing. Mismatch negativity, the surprise response, all these things are blunted at the perceptual level, at a higher level in terms of social functioning, blunted brain responses, which is appealing to the relaxation or the de-weighting, if you want, the lightening of these priors that generate those functions. Also, sensitivity to context, cognitive flexibility, and brain criticality are all tied in here, and in some ways bring us back to that slide that I showed you about 2A functioning and its involvement in plasticity and a receptive, sensitive brain. So this is now where I'm going to end it, just to say that this is a complex therapeutic model in a system that has a relaxed, if not collapsed, hierarchy and more information flow coming up and more flexible, freer dynamics. The system will be able to navigate a broader state space more freely, and that might be the kind of thing that relates to these reports of insight that you hear with psychedelics. Remember, psychedelic mind revealing, mind manifesting. So here's a patient saying, I had fresh insight into things. It was as if the scales dropped from my eyes. We know from a range of different studies that there's something about the experience, something about the psychedelic experience that seems to mediate the therapeutic response. Now our task is really to better characterize what that is, but insight may well be an important candidate here. Here we're measuring insight acutely, and we're seeing that it's correlating with drops in depression scores at 5 weeks, a key endpoint in our study. We're also trying to move away from this, I think, problematic, and I know others share this view, problematic notion of a mystical experience. You know, mysticism is the very antithesis, really, of what we are trying to do in science in terms of demystifying phenomena of nature. And so I don't think we can just sit on our hands and say the experience is mystical, that's what's doing it. So let's drill down and think a bit more carefully about, is there some aspect of this profound experience that could be mediating the response, that's something that we can understand a bit better and perhaps explain in mechanistic terms as well. So that's where we've come to this notion of emotional breakthrough. We're now measuring it with an inventory that we've developed. We've run an online study where we collect our data prospectively. We collect data at baseline before a planned psychedelic experience. We look at things like the nature of the experience, then we look at outcomes afterwards. And we found that this emotional breakthrough inventory is first of all distinct from the mystical experience and also distinct from a purely challenging experience, the kind of experience that people might use the term bad trip in association with. So there's this third component that seems to be key, and it's whether there is a overcoming or a breakthrough after potentially a period of struggle or challenge. And that's what we're measuring with this component. Does it predict improvements in well-being, for example? It seems to. It seems to perform well. It's also influenced by context, things like people's intention, the rapport or alliance they feel with those around them, and the setting, the environment that they're in at the time. Just to give you one example, given time of an item here, very simple, I had an emotional breakthrough. I'll give you another one. I was able to get a sense of closure on an emotional problem. So I think this is my last slide, but I'm conscious to wrap it up. And really the summary point with this slide is to address a major unknown and just flag it really, that although we're getting a bit of a handle and really I've boiled down a fair amount of brain imaging work that we've done looking at the acute psychedelic state, and now that others have done as well, into a model, this model of relaxed precision on high-level priors, allowing increased bottom-up information flow. But what we don't have is a good model resting on good evidence for the long-term brain effects of psychedelics. What accounts for people showing sustained drops in psychopathology or improvements in well-being or even changes in personality well after a psychedelic, months afterwards, maybe even years afterwards. What accounts for that in the brain? And the truth of it is we don't know. And so all we can do is come up with ideas, and really this is from limited data. For example, we scanned people a day after the second treatment session in our depression trial. We saw changes in a high-level network, the default mode network, that were actually in the opposite direction to what we see when we look at the brain during a psychedelic experience. So instead of a disintegration of this network that we see very markedly during a psychedelic experience, we see a reintegration. That got us thinking, and it also correlated with treatment response, that effect. And that got us thinking about this analogy of a reset, that you take the system, you create this window of very high plasticity, you kind of shake your snow globe if you want, and then you let the system recalibrate and reset. But it's just analogy at this stage. We've got other things that are referring to the brain being more sensitized to information here, increased responsiveness in the amygdala to emotional faces that correlated with treatment response. So I'll just leave with that reflection really, that this is a major knowledge gap, and it's such a key one to address. What are the longer term brain effects? Is the reset model all of it, or maybe there are things that are residual, components of brain changes that you'll see in the acute state that endure afterwards, like an enduring plasticity, for example, worth reflecting on. So just to end by thanking the group at Imperial, very much a group effort. They're a wonderful team of very passionate and motivated young scientists, and also those who are coming in now to keep us going. So thank you very much for your attention.
We have about 5-10 minutes for questions, actually. Ali's disappeared, so I hope his dead goods are going off now. I thought I might kick off. For those of you who are more sort of social, psychological models, you'll be pleased to know that the science is almost out of the way. But I have a few questions for those of you who would like to ask Robin or me anything about what's come up this morning, and then we'll move on to the more sort of therapeutic, psychological and subjective model of things. I can see, is that Sarah at the back? Yes, I did. Can someone perhaps go around with the microphone? One of the, or maybe it will be here.
Robin, I know in some of your papers you mentioned a change in the fractal dimension of neural activity. I'm really interested in that as a mathematician. Could you explain it, please?
Oh, well, I wish I could. I mean, I think the paper you're referring to is one that's in bioRxiv at the moment, so it's still actually under review. And the ins and outs of how our collaborators measured fracticality, I'm afraid I can't really speak to. But why are we looking at something like that? Well, it's a property of critical systems that they show something that's sometimes referred to as self-similarity, that if you look at different scales of the system, you'll see properties repeated at different scales, often in a power law related relationship. So how do I break that down? So for example, in terms of granular components of a system, there'll be lots of those, and then if we go up a level, smaller level of granularity, but fewer of them, and that rule goes up. But if you look at the essential patterns and configurations, you see those patterns repeated. Really nice analogies for fracticality. You could just think of fractal patterns, but or self-similarity, you could think of things like those Romanesque, are they called Romanesque? Broccolis, or what's another example of fractal systems? Earthquakes is another one that you'll rarely get a big, mama earthquake, and then you get lots of smaller ones. So anyway, what we were seeing under, in this case, I think we gave him both the psilocybin and LSD data sets were an increase in that organization. And it's a curious thing, it's speaking to the principle that the brain shows stronger signatures of criticality under a psychedelic. So instead of some sort of imbalances in the system, there's more of this fractal-like organization. It's being tuned closer to criticality. Another thing to say about criticality in terms of what it is it's a system that is nearing a phase transition, and it's on a spectrum from disorder or order to disorder. And as you come closer to this, as you tune up in terms of disorder, then you get to a critical point, which is hence the term criticality, in which you start seeing interesting emergent properties like fractal organization, critical slowing, so it's greater sensitivity to perturbation in such a system, and some other things as well that I can't think of right now. Yes.
So it's the sense then that the brain under psychedelics is more critical?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, it's being tuned closer to criticality. So it's actually suggesting that the brain in normal waking consciousness could exhibit stronger signatures of criticality than it already seems to, because already the brain seems to suggest that it's in a critical state, but it's suggesting that it can be tuned even more towards criticality, showing things like critical slowing to a greater extent. I mean, the brain shows criticality is telling us that we have a system that is neither so ordered that it's kind of frozen and unreceptive to influence, or a brain that's too chaotic, and so can't hold any information. So it's about this kind of critical sweet spot between those two extremes.
Yeah, for people who don't know what criticality is, you can imagine it a bit like sand going through a sand timer and building up as a pile of sand. And as the sand builds up, occasionally mounds of it fall off, and that's when it approaches criticality.
Yeah. Avalanche phenomena is another signature of a critical system. Yeah.
And how do you think that relates to, because the original observation of psychedelics was that they were psychotomimetic, that they mimicked some of the acute phases of psychosis. Do you think that's related in a...
Yeah, I do, in the sense that the model I'm presenting is one of fragmenting these high-level models, and you can think of fragmented self in early psychosis, for example, and then the kind of sensitivity to things that ordinarily would just be suppressed out, like an internal dialogue, for example, if you think of auditory hallucinations. Now you have a brain that's more sensitized, and although you don't see auditory hallucinations under psychedelics, you definitely see a heightened sensitization to context and information, whether it's coming from within the system, even memories, or whether it's coming from sensitivity to the external world, like a sensitivity to music, for example.
You do see a misplacing of auditory stimuli under psychedelics.
Yeah.
So people sometimes wonder whether they've spoken things out loud that actually they've just been their internal world. Interesting phenomenon. Does anyone else have any guy? John.
So I just wanted to change gear a little bit and ask what your take on current speculation about the value of microdosing is, because obviously microdosing would take us into a very different kind of realm of pharmacology. But there is really quite exaggerated claims made for it as well. And obviously there you're taking the drug repeatedly in the way that we conventionally treat with antidepressants. So I'd be interested in your take on what's out there.
So just so everyone could hear, the question was about microdosing and what Robin's take was on this, and whether we should be doing trials with microdosing.
So microdosing, taking very small amounts of a psychedelic more regularly. And how does it fit in with this scheme? And I do think my take on microdosing is that it's a very attenuated version of the same thing. So I still think that it's working on hierarchical organization in the brain and relaxing these hierarchies so that there can be a freeing up of cognition, a freeing up of affect. So I do actually think it's an attenuated version of the same thing. Yes, and
there was a recent paper which showed that microdoses of psilocybin have significant receptor occupancy. The one that you showed actually.
Yeah. I think it would still stand to reason that it's going to be the 2A receptors that are getting hit.
It's just a classic problem in pharmacology is you get a new drug, and you have to decide what dosage should be used there. And
we've got
it's just possible we're not in the right dose.
These
we can't do microdosing studies.
But these charts are really nice. Where we've got occupancy. In terms of suggesting a nonlinear relationship that low down, you have to get to a certain point before there's almost a step function and you're getting the full-on psychedelic experience. But otherwise you're getting something potentially quite attenuated, probably in a broader range of doses. You're just getting something that's kind of, if not sub-perceptible, not ego dissolution and not, peak experience. Which is, seeing these curves and they're quite intuitively appealing. That it was always something that we suspected, that there's a kind of inflection point where you reach a certain level of saturation of the 2A receptors, for example, certain dose of the psychedelic, and then you get the really interesting stuff. But I would suggest that lower down in the domain of microdosing, you're still loosening the mind, but it's just not thrown into this more dramatic opening, profound opening of the mind.
John?
Yeah, Robin, you mentioned one of the possible indications being anorexia for psychedelics. And I'm just wondering if you could expand on that, the evidence and the argument for it.
Yeah, the evidence is pretty thin. I mean, at the moment, there's just a collection of anecdotes from people drinking ayahuasca. But conceptually, I think it's really appealing if we think of people who are stuck in certain views, you know, that aren't reflective of reality, but they're so entrenched and obsessive. Then this is the kind of domain that we want to be bringing this treatment, I think. So with the right kind of management, which is critical. It's critical anyway, you know, but it's probably especially critical in such a vulnerable population with such high mortality rates and such like, that's really, and age is worth thinking about as well, that if this is rolled out, it could be quite a young population that would be being treated. So, but, you know, so difficult to treat and so tragic. So it's one of those situations where, forgive the way I'm spinning this, but it's almost unethical not to try, I think. Yeah.
David, I think we just have one more before the break. I'll try and shout.
Good. Thank you for the talk. I think you might have addressed this and may not have been understood, but is there a prominent neurophysiological understanding of how the high-level priors are relaxed, other than the sort of 5-HT2A receptor modulation?
Well, we could look at things like the integrity of high-level networks, which very reliably decrease in integrity under the psychedelic, and also rhythms associated with them that become much weaker, much diminished in their expression. There's a collapse in the oscillatory power. There's a drop in the expression of those rhythms. These are very strong candidates for correlates of the precision of priors, the integrity of these networks that likely subserve the priors and the rhythms that subserve them too. We could also take it down to the level of the single cells and look at things like the regularity of firing in pyramidal neurons, and also the way they couple with local field potentials. And there's evidence that there is a spike-to-wave decoupling with psychedelics. So you're exciting the system, but you're exciting single cells. You're making them more likely to fire, but that firing is happening in a less regular way. So these are all, strong candidates, you know, in sort of spatio-temporal domain in terms of integrity of a network, and also in the temporal domain more purely if we look at rhythms that are disrupted.
I guess the summary is there's only so far science can go, and that's about as far as we'll go this morning. We'll have a break, so there's coffee and refreshments outside, and we'll be back here in